No one remembers the first heartbeat of America. There was no drum roll, no declaration, no cheering crowd. There was only wind, moving endlessly across forests older than memory, across rivers that had never learned their own names, across a continent that did not yet know it would become an idea powerful enough to shake the world. Long before the word America was ever spoken aloud, the land was already alive. It breathed through the redwood forests of the West, where trees stood like ancient witnesses to centuries yet to come. It whispered through the Mississippi River, carrying stories from the north to the south, binding distant worlds together with water and time. It listened silently as footsteps, millions of them, crossed its soil, not as conquerors, but as caretakers. This was not an empty land waiting to be discovered. It was a world already full. For thousands of years, indigenous nations had lived, governed, traded, fought, loved, and remembered upon this land. The Iroquois Confederacy had built one of the most sophisticated political systems on Earth, balancing unity and independence long before Europe dreamed of democracy. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest constructed cities of stone and clay, aligned with the stars, enduring heat, drought, and invasion with quiet resilience. Along the Pacific coast, nations thrived on abundance, carving their histories into wood and memory. They did not draw borders the way later generations would. Their maps were rivers, seasons, and sacred stories. And then, slowly, uncertainly, the horizon changed. In the late 15th century, rumors began to drift across the Atlantic like smoke before fire. European kingdoms, hungry for wealth and power, spoke of unknown lands beyond the edge of familiar maps. Gold, spices, glory, these words carried men across dangerous waters, driven by ambition and fear in equal measure. When Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he believed he had found Asia. What he truly found was the beginning of an irreversible collision between worlds. The Americas would soon become the stage for one of history's most profound transformations, one marked by exploration and exchange, but also by violence, disease, and loss on a scale the world had never seen. Spanish conquistadors arrived first, armored and ruthless, carrying swords, crosses, and invisible enemies. Smallpox swept through indigenous populations like a silent apocalypse, killing millions before many had even seen a European face. Entire civilizations weakened not by battle, but by microbes. Yet even as empires crumbled, resistance never vanished. Across the continent, native nations adapted, fought, negotiated, and survived. They formed alliances, learned new technologies, and preserved their identities against impossible odds. The story of America did not begin with European settlement. It began with endurance. By the early 1600s, the English arrived with different intentions. They did not come merely to extract wealth and return home. They came to stay. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was not the triumph it would later be portrayed as. It was a desperate gamble. Starvation, leadership failed, disease spread. Without the aid of the Powhatan Confederacy, aid that came at great cost to indigenous sovereignty, the settlement would have collapsed entirely. Survival, not freedom, defined early colonial life. 13 years later, another group crossed the Atlantic under very different motivations. The Pilgrims, seeking religious autonomy, landed at Plymouth in 2020. Their story would be mythologized into a narrative of divine destiny and cooperation,
But the reality was more complex. Their survival depended heavily on native knowledge, how to plant crops, how to hunt, how to live with the land rather than against it. Gratitude existed, so did tension. As more settlers arrived, the fragile balance broke. Land, once shared through understanding, became property measured by deeds and fences. Expansion meant displacement. Fear bred violence. Treaties were signed and broken. Still, the colonies grew. By the mid-1700s, 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, each with its own character, economy, and social structure. New England focused on trade and shipbuilding. The middle colonies thrived on agriculture and diversity. The southern colonies built immense wealth on plantations, but that wealth rested on history's darkest foundation: slavery. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, packed into ships under inhumane conditions, and sold as property in a land that spoke of God and liberty while denying both to those in chains. Their labor fueled the colonial economy. Their suffering built fortunes. Their resistance, quiet and loud, planted the seeds of future reckoning. America was being built, but it was already divided. And then came the question that changed everything. Who had the right to rule? By the 1760s, the British Crown, burdened with debt from global wars, turned to its colonies for revenue. Taxes were imposed without colonial representation. Laws tightened. Voices rose in protest. What had once been loyalty slowly transformed into resentment. Pamphlets circulated. Taverns buzzed with debate. Ordinary people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, began to speak of ideas once reserved for philosophers: natural rights, consent of the governed, liberty. Rebellion was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. But no one yet knew the cost. Because America, as an idea, had not been born in triumph. It would be born in blood, contradiction, courage, and unfinished promises. And the land, ancient, patient, watching, would remember it all.
By the time the first musket was fired, the fracture had already happened. It did not begin with gunpowder. It began with paper. In candle-lit rooms and crowded taverns, ink became a weapon. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand, read aloud to those who could not read themselves. One small booklet, cheaply printed and dangerously persuasive, spread faster than any official decree from London. Common sense. Thomas Paine did not speak like a philosopher. He spoke like a man who had decided he was done asking permission. Kings, he argued, were not ordained by God. An island, he insisted, had no natural right to rule a continent. Monarchy was not stability. It was corruption inherited by birth rather than earned by merit. For many colonists, Paine gave voice to a feeling they had not yet dared to name: independence. Still, rebellion was terrifying. The British Empire was the most powerful force on earth. Its navy ruled the seas. Its army was professional, trained, experienced. To challenge it was to risk everything: homes, families, lives. And yet, resistance grew. In Boston, tension had already spilled into violence years earlier. British soldiers sent to enforce order were seen not as protectors but as occupiers. In 1770, a confrontation escalated into gunfire. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. The event would be remembered not as an accident, but as a massacre. Memory became propaganda. Then came the tea. In 1773, when Parliament granted the East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants while maintaining taxation, anger boiled over.
On a cold December night, men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the black water. The message was unmistakable. Britain responded not with compromise, but with punishment. Ports were closed, self-governance was restricted, troops were quartered among civilians. These intolerable acts, as colonists named them, united colonies that had previously been divided. An attack on one was now an attack on all. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They did not yet call themselves a nation. They called themselves concerned subjects of the Crown. They petitioned, they protested, they prepared, and they armed themselves. When British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord in April 1775 to seize colonial weapons, they expected compliance. What they found instead was defiance. No one knows who fired the first shot. History remembers it simply as the shot heard round the world. Farmers stood against redcoats. Militias formed lines they had never practiced. The British advanced. The colonists retreated. Then they regrouped, firing from behind trees and stone walls, turning a traditional march into a deadly gauntlet. By the end of the day, the empire had been bloodied by men it once dismissed as subjects. The war had begun. Yet revolution was not universally supported. Nearly a third of colonists remained loyal to the Crown. Families split. Neighbors turned against neighbors. In some regions, the conflict resembled civil war more than revolution. George Washington was chosen to lead the Continental Army, not because he was the best general, but because he symbolized unity. A Virginian commanding New England troops sent a clear message: this struggle belonged to all colonies. Washington faced impossible odds. His army was undertrained, undersupplied, and unpaid. Desertion was constant. Disease killed more men than battle. Winter camps became tests of endurance rather than strategy. Valley Forge nearly broke them. Men lacked shoes. Blood stained the snow. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. And yet they stayed. Not because victory seemed likely, but because surrender seemed worse. Slowly, discipline replaced chaos. Training improved. Leadership matured. The army became something more than a rebellion. It became a force. Across the Atlantic, eyes watched closely. France, still smarting from defeat by Britain in earlier wars, saw opportunity. American success at Saratoga in 1777 proved the rebellion could win. French support, money, weapons, ships transformed the conflict from colonial uprising into global war. Spain and the Netherlands followed quietly. The world had chosen sides. In 1776, even as battles raged, delegates gathered once more in Philadelphia. This time they did not petition, they declared. The Declaration of Independence was not merely a document, it was a gamble written in ink. To sign it was to commit treason. If the revolution failed, every signer would hang. The words were bold, almost dangerously so. All men are created equal. It was a promise not yet kept, but it was spoken aloud nonetheless. War dragged on for years, brutal, uncertain, exhausting. Cities fell and were retaken. Victories were followed by crushing defeats. Civilians suffered. Economies collapsed. Hope rose and fell with every season. Then, in 1781, everything narrowed to a single place, Yorktown. Surrounded by American and French forces on land and trapped by French ships at sea, British General Cornwallis faced the inevitable. When he surrendered, the music reportedly played was "The World Turned Upside Down." It had. The war did not end instantly, but its outcome was sealed. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. Against all odds, the colonies had won. But victory brought new questions. What kind of nation had been created? Freedom was declared, but not defined. Power was rejected, but not replaced. Unity had been forged in war, but peace would test it far more severely. America was free, but it was not yet whole. The revolution had broken the chains of empire. Now came the far harder task, building a nation that could survive its own ideals.
Winning the war had been the easy part. Peace exposed the fractures that gunfire had temporarily hidden. 13 former colonies, now calling themselves states, stood together in name but not in practice. They were bound loosely by the Articles of Confederation, a document born from fear. Fear of tyranny, fear of centralized power, fear of becoming what they had just defeated. Under the Articles, the national government was deliberately weak. It could not levy taxes, it could not regulate commerce, it could not enforce its own laws. Each state guarded its sovereignty like a jealous heir, suspicious of any authority beyond its borders. The result was chaos. War debts mounted, soldiers went unpaid, states printed their own currencies, triggering inflation and distrust. Trade disputes flared. Foreign nations questioned whether the United States would survive long enough to matter. Then came Shays' Rebellion. In 1786, Massachusetts farmers, many of them veterans, rose in protest against crushing debt and foreclosures. Courthouses were shut down by force. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but its message echoed loudly. If the government could not maintain order, liberty itself was at risk. Reluctantly, leaders admitted what they had long avoided. The Articles were failing. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, officially to revise the existing system. Unofficially, many knew they were there to start over. The doors were closed, windows were shut against the heat and against the public. What emerged would shape the future of not just a nation, but a global experiment in self-rule. The debates were fierce. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states demanded equality. Northern states questioned slavery. Southern states insisted on it. Everyone feared concentration of power, yet everyone recognized the need for authority. Compromise became survival. The Great Compromise created a bicameral legislature. The 3/5 Compromise counted enslaved people not as citizens, but as fractions for representation without rights. Power was divided between branches. Checks were layered against ambition. The Constitution was not perfect. It was political triage. Ratification was uncertain. Anti-Federalists warned that the new government would trample freedoms. Federalists argued that without strength, liberty would dissolve into anarchy. Newspapers became battlegrounds. Essays, later known as the Federalist Papers, defended the framework with logic and urgency. Eventually, the promise of a Bill of Rights tipped the scales. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. His presence alone lent legitimacy to an untested system. When he stepped into office, he did so cautiously, aware that every decision would set precedent. He declined titles of royalty. He stepped down after 2 terms. He demonstrated that power could be held and surrendered peacefully. The Republic survived its infancy. But beneath the surface, contradictions festered. Slavery remained entrenched. Native lands continued to shrink under relentless expansion. Women, though essential to the nation's survival, were denied political voice. The ideals proclaimed in 1776 echoed loudly, but selectively. America had declared itself free. It had not yet decided for whom. As the 19th century dawned, the young nation expanded westward, fueled by belief as much as opportunity. Rivers became highways, trails carved paths into unknown territories. Settlers chased land, wealth, and reinvention. They also carried conflict with them. Native nations were pushed aside through treaties signed under pressure and broken with ease.
Removal became policy, suffering became routine. Progress in the American imagination demanded space, and space was taken. Meanwhile, invention transformed daily life. Cotton gins shrunk distances, steamboats shrunk distances. Industry began its slow, unstoppable rise. Cities grew, class divisions deepened, and always, looming over everything, was the question that refused to disappear. Could a nation half free and half enslaved endure? Compromises delayed confrontation. New states were balanced like weights on a scale, free, then slave. Each decision postponed reckoning, but never resolved it. By the 1840s and 1850s, the strain became unbearable. Abolitionist voices grew louder. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways: escape, rebellion, endurance. The Underground Railroad carried hope through darkness. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin shook consciences. The nation argued with itself relentlessly. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1960, Southern states interpreted it as a threat to their way of life. Secession followed swiftly. Fort Sumter fell. The Union shattered. What began as a constitutional crisis became the bloodiest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother. Fields became graves. Ideals were tested in fire. The Civil War would decide more than borders. It would decide whether the American experiment was a lie or a promise worth dying for.
When the first cannons roared over Charleston Harbor, no one truly understood what had been unleashed. Both sides believed the war would be brief. Both were catastrophically wrong. The Civil War did not begin as a crusade to end slavery. It began as a fight to preserve the Union. Abraham Lincoln knew the country was fragile, beyond repair, and his primary goal was survival of the nation, of the Constitution, of the experiment begun less than a century earlier. But war has a way of clarifying truths that politics avoids. The early years were brutal and uncertain. Battles like Bull Run shattered illusions of glory. Soldiers marched into combat with enthusiasm and emerged with horror etched into memory. New technologies, rifled muskets, ironclads, railroads, turned old tactics into mass slaughter. Death became industrial. On both sides, armies grew vast. Camps spread disease. Letters home carried hope, fear, and resignation. Civilians were pulled into the conflict as farms were burned, cities occupied, and families divided beyond repair. And still, slavery remained. Enslaved people did not wait for freedom to be granted. They fled plantations. They sabotaged production. They offered intelligence to Union forces. With each escape, the war shifted, not just militarily, but morally. Lincoln understood the moment. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the conflict. It did not free all enslaved people instantly, but it declared that slavery would die with the rebellion. The war now carried a moral weight that reached beyond borders. Europe watched closely. Support for the Confederacy weakened. Black soldiers joined the Union ranks, fighting for a freedom they had never been allowed to claim. Their courage was undeniable. Their sacrifice was immense. The cost of war escalated relentlessly. Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, names that would forever mark the American conscience. Fields turned red. Entire towns mourned. No family remained untouched. At Gettysburg, Lincoln spoke words that would outlive the war itself. He reframed sacrifice as purpose, insisting that the nation must ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Victory came slowly, painfully. In 1865, Confederate forces collapsed. Richmond burned.
Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The war ended not with celebration, but exhaustion. Then, just as the nation dared to breathe again, Lincoln was assassinated. Hope died in a theater. Reconstruction began without its architect. The task ahead was monumental: reunite a shattered nation, redefine citizenship, and integrate millions of newly freed people into a society that had never imagined them as equals. Amendments were passed, slavery was abolished, citizenship was defined, voting rights were promised. But promises require enforcement. Resistance emerged immediately. White supremacist groups terrorized black communities. Southern states enacted black codes to preserve control. Federal commitment wavered. Political will faded. Reconstruction ended not with resolution, but retreat. Segregation hardened. Violence replaced law. Freedom existed on paper while oppression ruled daily life. And still, in betrayal, progress left its mark. Institutions were built, communities formed, education spread. The idea of equality, once declared, once defended by war, could not be erased. The nation moved forward unevenly. Railroads stitched the continent together. Industry roared. Immigrants arrived by the millions, chasing opportunity and survival. Cities exploded with energy and inequality. Wealth concentrated. Labor struggled. America entered the modern age, powerful, ambitious, and deeply conflicted. The Civil War had answered one question decisively. The Union would endure. But it left another unanswered. Would freedom ever truly mean the same thing for all Americans? The answer would not come quickly. It would come through struggle, protest, sacrifice, and time. And the next century would test the nation in ways the founders could never have imagined.
America did not step quietly into the modern world. It arrived in smoke. By the late 19th century, the nation was transforming faster than its people could comprehend. Railroads cut through mountains and plains, binding oceans together with iron. Factories rose where farms once stood. Cities swelled upward and outward, crowded with ambition, desperation, and noise. This was the age of steel. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan built empires that reshaped the economy and the balance of power within the nation. Their wealth was unprecedented. So was the inequality it created. While fortunes accumulated in marble mansions, workers labored in dangerous conditions for wages barely sufficient to survive. Children worked. Accidents were routine. Unions were crushed with force. Yet the promise of America remained magnetic. Millions crossed oceans to reach its shores. Italians, Irish, Jews, Germans, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, each carried stories of hunger, persecution, and hope. Ellis Island processed humanity in endless lines, turning names into numbers, dreams into possibility. They built the cities. They powered the machines. They changed the nation's identity forever. But acceptance was never guaranteed. Nativism surged. Laws restricted immigration. Racism hardened into policy. Opportunity existed, but it was unevenly distributed and fiercely contested. As America industrialized, it also expanded beyond its borders. In 1898, the Spanish-American War marked a turning point. In just months, the United States emerged not only victorious, but transformed, now in possession of overseas territories and a growing sense of global responsibility, or global ambition. Debate raged. Was America meant to be an empire,
or a republic that resisted imperial temptation? The answer, as always, was complicated. Power expanded, even as ideals were defended. At home, reform movements rose to confront the excesses of the Gilded Age. Journalists exposed corruption. Progressives fought for labor protections, women's suffrage, and government accountability. Slowly, unevenly, change followed. Then the world caught fire. In 1914, Europe plunged into war. America hesitated, clinging to neutrality while profiting from trade. But isolation proved impossible. Submarine warfare, economic ties, and ideological alignment drew the nation in. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, it did so as a rising power, industrial, confident, untested on a global battlefield. The war ended quickly for America, but its impact lingered. President Woodrow Wilson spoke of making the world safe for democracy. His vision reshaped international politics, even as the nation itself retreated into isolation afterward. The 1920s roared. Jazz filled the air, cars filled the streets, stock markets soared. Prohibition outlawed alcohol and created crime. Women gained the right to vote. Culture accelerated. Consumption became identity. Then, suddenly, it all collapsed. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Breadlines stretched through once prosperous streets. The Great Depression shattered faith in endless growth. Despair was widespread, but so was resilience. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal redefined the relationship between government and citizens. Programs provided relief, reform, and recovery. The federal government became a stabilizing force, reshaping American expectations forever. And then, once more, the world descended into war. World War II demanded everything. Industry mobilized, women filled factories, science accelerated, rationing became routine, sacrifice was national. The war also revealed contradictions. Japanese Americans were interned. Segregation persisted even as freedom was defended abroad. Still, the fight against fascism united the nation in purpose. Victory in 1945 left America changed beyond recognition. Its cities stood intact while others lay in ruins. Its economy surged. Its military reach spanned the globe. With the atomic bomb, it held power capable of ending civilization itself. The United States emerged not just victorious, but dominant, a superpower. Yet triumph carried responsibility and danger. A new conflict began, quieter but no less consequential. Ideology replaced armies. Fear replaced fronts. The Cold War had begun. America now stood at the center of a divided world, tasked with defending freedom while wrestling with its own unfinished promises. The question that followed was inevitable. Could a nation born in rebellion lead the world without losing its soul?